Hey everybody, this is Darren Van Dam and you're watching Flick Connection, the show that helps you get more out of movies, and today we're going to be talking about 20 overlooked movies currently included with HBO Max. So this will be a list of 20 movies currently included with HBO Max. It's going to be a bunch of hidden gems I know you've probably never heard of before, but this list also includes a couple of new release movies that were just overlooked last year. They did not get the appreciation they deserved. They're currently on HBO Max. We're going to talk about them. But before telling you about these 20 overlooked movies, I need to tell you about today's sponsor, Athletic Greens. Now, I don't only recommend them because they're a sponsor, I recommend them because I actually drink this stuff every day. So about a year ago, I decided I wanted to get in the best shape of my life for a couple of reasons. One is I just want to look a little better on camera, but I also want to be protected against COVID-19 and other viral infections. I'd like to be as resilient as possible. And it's gone great. I've put on a lot of muscle, I've shed a lot of body fat, and I feel better than ever. And while I find it's pretty easy to load up with lots of protein throughout the day, it is hard to get all of the nutrition that I want from a green-based diet as well, which is why Athletic Greens is such a great supplement to my lifestyle. Athletic Greens is absolutely packed with vitamins and minerals, probiotics, antioxidants, and digestive enzymes that are going to help you get better nutrient absorption so you get more out of this tiny little 8-ounce drink. And right now, when my viewers use the link in the video description below, they'll actually get a year's supply of vitamin D3 and K2, which is going to further support your immune system, and I don't know why you wouldn't want to have the best immune system possible right now. That free gift also includes travel packs of the Athletic Greens powder. You get the big bag of Athletic Greens, the jar to put in your fridge, the bottle to drink it out of, and the free year of vitamin D3, K2, and the travel packs. And as someone that used to juice fresh greens, while I do know that it's very good for you, not only does it make a huge mess, it also tastes like something scraped out from underneath a lawnmower. I can tell you, Athletic Greens has kind of a sweet taste to it that is much more pleasant than freshly juiced greens. So if you want to take some ownership of your health, this is an easy way to do it. Just visit that link in the description. But let's go ahead and move on with my list of the top 20 most overlooked movies on HBO Max, starting with one from 2013 called The East. Now, this is from the same creator and director as the Netflix original series The OA, and story-wise, The East is completely different. There's really no crossover, but thematically there are some similarities, and it does have a similar vibe, meaning if you liked The OA, I strongly recommend checking out The East. But in this movie, a woman infiltrates an anarchist group and then begins to get sucked in. She may or may not start believing what some of this anarchist group is actually doing, and some of it can be quite awful, but all the characters are well written. Obviously, it's really well acted. You've got some good actors in this one, and the directing is a little subtle. It's got a slow pace to it. There's some subtle themes in there, but it's really well crafted. This is just one that is not for everybody, but again, if you enjoyed The OA, make this one of the next movies you watch. My number 19 pick is also not for everyone, but I will explain why. This too has a really incredible cast, even better than The East. You've got Julianne Moore, Mark Ruffalo, Danny Glover, and more in Blindness. Now, this is actually based on a book by the same name and is basically about a virus or something that suddenly robs everyone of their sight. So immediately, large swaths of the world go completely blind. And the story itself largely unfolds inside of a camp where blind people are quarantined, and in the land of the blind, so to speak, things get out of hand very, very quickly. This movie does feature pretty graphic depictions of sexual assault because that sort of goes with the territory as their society begins to collapse inside these camps. It's dark, gritty stuff, but it's also an interesting portrait as to what might happen in this scenario. While this is a heavy movie, there's not much levity to it at all, and you're not going to particularly feel entertained after having watched it. It is expertly directed, really well done. If the concept interests you at all, or maybe you're one of the few people that actually read the book, I highly recommend checking this movie out. Now, if you're like me and your kids keep getting sent home from school sporadically and unexpectedly, then you may need something new for them to watch, because there hasn't been a lot coming out for kids, at least not theatrically, over the last couple of years. But epic is one from the last 10 years or so that I think kids and adults will enjoy alike. In this movie, you follow fairies and little people that live underneath the grass and the weeds. It's a really beautiful world. The graphics are a little bit dated because I said this movie's almost 10 years old, but still beautifully designed all the way down to the villains. They've got a really interesting look, and this story takes place in a fairly unfamiliar place. But this ultimately just becomes a good classic adventure story. Like I said, you will enjoy this just as much as the kids, and it's sort of this big budget, for lack of a better word, epic story that has largely gone unnoticed because it gets overshadowed by all the stuff that Disney and Pixar are putting out. But in my book, story-wise, this one is just as good as anything they've been putting out lately. Okay, because I am Darren Van Dam and this is Flick Connection, we are going to talk about some movies that are not appropriate for the kids. My next pick is definitely one of those movies, so make sure they're not in the room when you watch this one. In fact, you might want to make sure they're not even in the same city as you when you watch Hobo with a Shotgun. This stars the late, great Rutger Hauer in one of his last big starring roles. Now, this is a smaller movie, but Hauer was really famous for playing bad guys, hitmen. He's got a perfect look for it, obviously, but he's also really good at it. Point is, you don't see him as the leading man very often, but Hobo with a Shotgun is a rare exception, and I'm glad that they chose him for this movie. He is perfect for it. What you get with this movie is a classic, disgusting grindhouse flick. But Hobo with a Shotgun is done with this flair and this color that just looks fresh and new. Despite being a solid 10 or 11 years old now, Hobo with a Shotgun is still a really cool flick, especially if you're into more violent, over-the-top movies. This one goes in some wild directions. It takes place in this lawless wasteland of a city. It's wild stuff, but really entertaining, especially because Rutger Hauer carries this thing so well and does such a great job acting in a movie that's kind of designed to be like a drive-in sort of B-level movie. A lot of the cheesiness in Hobo with a Shotgun is done intentionally and is done so well that you can kind of tell, meaning Hobo with a Shotgun is incredibly self-aware, which is what makes it so good and so entertaining. Keep in mind though, don't let me oversell this one. This is for people who really like some grungy movies. Schwarzenegger makes the list despite the fact that most, if not all, of his movies that came out prior to him being the governor of California are all really highly watched and loved movies, meaning you wouldn't call them overlooked. However, there is one action flick he did that I think never got the respect it deserved: Eraser. Now, similar to Hobo with a Shotgun, Eraser is over the top, it's incredibly far-fetched, but similar to Hobo with a Shotgun, it is incredibly self-aware, which is why I love this movie. Now, this is far from my favorite Schwarzenegger movie. He's done way too many classic movies for this one to be up there. However, this one still makes for a really fun watch. You've also got Vanessa Williams in this, who you don't see in movies like this very often, but this is one of the better ones that she did do. And then above all else, you get really fun action sequences, including the one in the plane. Again, wild, over-the-top stuff, but it's just incredibly fun to watch. And in a filmography that's just so packed with classic action movies, this one is kind of in the middle of the pack, but again, I think it still never quite got the respect it deserved. My next pick is a sequel to one of the best zombie movies ever made, and while the sequel is not nearly as good as the original, 28 Weeks Later is still a pretty solid sequel. Now, this one got overshadowed because obviously it's not as good as the original, but also it came out the same year as Planet Terror, directed by Robert Rodriguez. And even though they came out weeks apart, they both miraculously feature a helicopter decapitating a whole army of zombies. But story-wise, 28 Weeks Later makes sense. It's a decent follow-up to the original 28 Days Later. I think the characters are a little bit underdeveloped. However, you still do get some great actors in this, with Robert Carlyle, Imogen Poots, Idris Elba, Rose Byrne, and Jeremy Renner. I feel like a lot of people don't remember him being in this movie, but he was in this movie well before he was an Avenger. I'll also admit, I think the tone is a little bit off in this movie. It's fine as a standalone movie, but the tone doesn't quite match 28 Days Later. That movie is a little bit darker than this one, and this one does become a little bit more of an action movie, but that is a nitpick in what is an otherwise pretty excellent zombie flick. My next pick is one of the few comedies on this list, and it was criminally overlooked when it came out, despite the fact that it not only stars Jason Bateman, it was written and directed by him. If that doesn't really ring your bell, keep in mind, he also wrote and directed portions of Ozark, and I think maybe some of the best episodes of that series were helmed by him. But in Bad Words, he actually plays an adult competing in a children's spelling bee competition.
Hi, I'm Chaitanya Chopra. What's your name?
Spin it around.
What was your winning word?
It was autofellatio.
I've never heard of that word.
If you don't point that curry hole that way and sit your fucking ass down in that seat, I'm gonna tell the captain that your bag's ticking.
Now, there are reasons why he's doing this, but what you really get with Bad Words is Jason Bateman being a horrible human being to very young kids. He's essentially trying to elbow his way through this competition. It's kind of cringy and hard to watch at times, but it's also really funny if you allow yourself to get into it. If you think you're gonna have trouble laughing at Jason Bateman being cruel to children, you may want to pass on this one, but if what I'm showing you looks funny to you, I can tell you this is a really solid flick, and I'm surprised he has not directed more comedies after this one. Another offbeat comedy that came out just a year ago is KAJILLIONAIRE. This stars Evan Rachel Wood as the daughter of a family of grifters, people that really just live on the take. One of the more interesting things about this movie is watching this family basically try to get by on nothing. KAJILLIONAIRE does have a slow pace. It takes quite a bit of time before a story begins to develop, but when it does so pretty organically, and it is interesting. However, this is more of an art house film. If you don't typically find that you like art house movies or slower paced movies like this, KAJILLIONAIRE is probably not going to be for you. But if you like Evan Rachel Wood and some of the other people in it, then I can tell you it's a very, very interesting movie. In fact, some of you would rank this movie much higher because it is quite good, but because it's so offbeat and really not for everybody, I did have to put it in the bottom half of this list. But with that, we'll go to my number 12 pick, which is another comedy. There's not many more on this list, but this one is really for almost everybody except for very young kids because it's a fairly adult-oriented comedy. Take Me Home Tonight. Now, this takes place in the 80s, and it's kind of your typical 80s party movie slash romantic comedy, yet it's also neither. This movie actually kind of dips its toe in the water in multiple genres, and I think it does so pretty successfully. Now, Topher Grace is the lead in this movie, but Dan Fogler plays his best friend and really makes this movie what it is. His character sets this movie over the top and makes it much funnier than I think it otherwise would have been. And there are some classic lines in this movie, some really fun sequences, a killer 80s soundtrack, and the rom-com stuff is not too heavy-handed. It feels pretty genuine. It's actually quite nice. Teresa Palmer plays the love interest, and she is in a ton of movies, and while I can't say I love everything that she's in, I can honestly say I think I love her in everything. She always does a great job, and this is no exception. If you want to watch a fun 80s movie that's only about 10 years old, then Take Me Home Tonight is going to be the ticket for you. Alright, technically the last comedy on the list is also animated, but it is stop motion animation, and it's a movie that's only a couple of years old. Early Man comes from the Aardman Animation Studio. They're most famous for Wallace and Gromit, Shaun the Sheep, things like that. Not only is their animation style beautiful in everything that they do, but their sense of humor is unlike anything else. I love what Pixar does. I think they've got a great sense of humor over there, but I'm really partial to Aardman. I think everything that they do is really clever, not only conceptually, but even just the little jokes that they pepper in through all of this stuff that is actually real. It's all stop motion. It all existed in a real space at one time, and you can tell and you can feel it, and the amount of detail that they bring to their sets and environments and their characters is just really second to none. I absolutely love every frame of Aardman movies, and Early Man is about cavemen that discover soccer and then they compete against people in the Bronze Age. While kids will find this movie really funny and fun to watch, having some sort of a sense of history makes the movie even more funny because so many of the jokes are Bronze Age based. And while Early Man is not my favorite movie from that studio, it's only a couple of years old. If you've missed it and you've liked anything else that they've done, I highly recommend checking this one out. Now, my number 10 pick comes from an indie director that I love, and I've recommended his other movies, Street Thief and Cash Only, multiple times on this channel, but those are both smaller movies. His biggest movie to date stars Liam Hemsworth and is called Killerman.
Drive!
Now this came out in 2019, the same year as Uncut Gems, and also takes place in Manhattan's Diamond District. And as much as I loved Uncut Gems and all the cutting edge stuff they did with that movie, I understand it's not for everybody. KILLERMAN, however, I think is going to reach a much wider audience. In fact, this is probably what some of you had in mind when you sat down to watch Uncut Gems. Meaning it does follow a somewhat formulaic footprint, but Malik Bader, the director, has a real hard edge to him when it comes to the violence. The violence in his movies, particularly in Cash Only and this one, is pretty visceral. Now, I've seen worse things in movies, but he does it in a way where you don't quite see it coming, and it's pretty bloody. In fact, I felt the production company was probably holding him back a little bit in this movie. I think he maybe wanted to go a little bit harder on some stuff. The reason I point that out is while this movie is a bit of a crowd pleaser, it is pretty intense at times as well, so be prepared for that. But in this movie, Liam Hemsworth plays a money launderer who is in a car accident and gets amnesia in the middle of a pretty intense moment in his life. I'm not going to give away too many details, but suddenly you've got a criminal who doesn't know where money is, doesn't know who people are, and it makes for an interesting setup. I will say I don't think KILLERMAN quite utilized that gimmick enough, but the crime elements in this movie, if you just watch it as a crime movie, they're all quite good, and again, it's quite visceral and raw. It feels pretty real at times. In fact, I think had they used an unfamiliar face, someone other than Hemsworth, don't get me wrong, he did a good job, but I think if it had been an unknown face, this would have felt incredibly real because of the way that Bader directed this thing. So I'm obviously a fan. This movie's far from perfect, but it's my type of thing. If you generally like my crime recommendations, KILLERMAN is going to be for you, trust me. Now, my number 9 pick is from one of my all-time favorite directors, Danny Boyle. He's responsible for gems like Trainspotting, 28 Days Later, Sunshine, and he's won Academy Awards. He's a great director. This is one of his weaker movies, but it still makes it to my number 9 spot. It's called Trance, and it's got a pretty good cast. You've got James McAvoy, Rosario Dawson, and Vincent Cassel. And in this movie, James McAvoy's character visits a hypnotherapist to try to locate a lost, valuable painting. Ultimately turns into this crime caper, but what's interesting about Trance is the hypnotherapy actually causes some side effects. Nothing crazy, nothing too sci-fi, but it makes it difficult for the character to quite know what's real, what's not, what's been put in his head, and what actually took place. And Danny Boyle made it work. It is far from perfect. In fact, it can be kind of confusing and it can feel a little bit messy, but it was such a bizarre concept and such a hard thing to maybe rein in. Maybe that's why you're still left with a really excellent thriller that was directed by a great director. It just ultimately falls short of maybe the greatness it could have achieved with such a good director and such a good cast. That said, it's still a really slick movie that I know a lot of people passed on. Now, obviously, World War II was one of the biggest moments in human history, and some of the best movies of all time are about World War II. My next pick isn't quite one of those, but I think it came damn close and is still really underappreciated. I'm talking about Mel Gibson's Hacksaw Ridge. Now, in this movie, Andrew Garfield plays Desmond Doss, who was a conscientious objector during World War II. For religious reasons, he wanted to save people and not have to shoot anybody. Not only is that an interesting and true story, but the way Hacksaw Ridge develops is you get this incredibly long, I guess we'll call a series of action sequences of this medic rescuing people from very hostile territory with no weapons. It makes for some wild sequences. Obviously there are embellishments, but to know that this is something that actually happened makes for pretty wild stuff. And you also get a fantastic supporting cast. Like Andrew Garfield is great as the lead, but you've got a great role from Vince Vaughn, Sam Worthington, Hugo Weaving, and Teresa Palmer again. Now, I recently did talk about Apocalypto, also directed by Mel Gibson. Well, I think Hacksaw Ridge is not his best movie. It's still a really fantastic World War II movie that just did not get the respect it deserved. Now, my number 7 pick is also an animated movie that's family friendly, but it's from the 80s, and it's one of the more overlooked movies from Studio Ghibli, who created classics like Howl's Moving Castle and Spirited Away. But Nausicaa, Valley of the Wind is this big epic with giant monsters and all sorts of wild stuff going on in it, and a beautiful aesthetic and color palette. So the look and feel is dated. This is from the mid-80s, yet the design and the art on screen is all stunning and beautiful. This takes place on a dying planet and largely feels kind of like a post-apocalyptic story. But in this movie, the central character is a princess who is trying to keep these two warring nations from destroying their already dying planet. So there's some really heavy themes with this one that I think are gonna thoroughly entertain adults. This is a fairly mature movie, yet it does have enough going on to keep kids really entertained. However, there are large monsters and things in this. It could be frightening for very, very young kids, but if this is one that you passed on and you like fantasy movies from the 80s, movies like Labyrinth and The Never-Ending Story, this one is different because it's an animated movie from Japan, but I think it goes right along with those and has a lot in common with them, meaning fans of those movies should really love this one as well. Now we'll change things up quite a bit with an all-out action movie starring Jet Li in one of the most vicious roles he's ever done in Unleashed. In this movie, Jet Li is essentially the pet of a gangster played by Bob Hoskins. He's literally treated like a dog. He is taught how to fight, but he's given a collar, he's fed SpaghettiOs out of a can, which is really not that bad if you ask me, but you also get a great role from Morgan Freeman, who plays a blind man who tunes pianos, and this is a Luc Besson production. While this is not the best movie Jet Li has ever been in, I think this is one of his best roles. It may not seem like it at first, but his performance has quite a broad spectrum here. I mean, he goes into full rage mode, and then he has really tender moments as well, and his character develops throughout this movie and has a really fantastic character arc. So in terms of acting, this is some of the best work Jet Li ever did, and then in terms of action, it's got some really gritty, visceral action sequences. They will feel slightly dated because movies like this done today feel even more real because of movies like John Wick and the Raid series. However, it's not that dated. This is still a pretty slick movie with some great characters, a good story, even if the overall concept is a little bit silly and cheesy. The seriousness of everything else manages to kind of glue this thing together and make it work as a pretty solid action flick. We're going to change things up again, though, with my number 5 pick, which is another animated movie from the 80s that has just not held an audience over time the way I think it should have, Watership Down. Now, this is obviously based on a children's book by the same name, but this is an incredible adaptation. While the story is aimed at kids, I can tell you there is quite a bit of violence in Watership Down, including some bloodshed and some dead rabbits. Because essentially what the core story of Watership Down is a small group of rabbits trying to find a place to live. But what makes that interesting is the world in which rabbits live is such a dangerous place. Everything wants to eat them, they're constantly on the run, and Watership Down inspired a lot of things. In fact, watching this movie reminded me a lot of shows like The Walking Dead. You've got people that are living like nomads in that show, trying to move from place to place in this incredibly hostile world. Thematically, there is a lot of crossover with Watership Down. When you watch this movie, you will understand. Don't watch this one with very young kids. It is going to be pretty upsetting and maybe even a little scarring for them, but kids that are maybe getting a little more mature, they're in school, they're starting to read, this could be a really interesting watch for them. Now, I did promise some new releases on this list, and The Last Duel is currently included with HBO Max. This came out in theaters just a few months ago. It's directed by Ridley Scott, and it stars Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, and Adam Driver in this essentially a tale about knights. However, this movie revolves around rape or an accusation of rape, and the way it's structured is you revisit that moment 3 different times from 3 different points of view, and as repetitive as that sounds, Ridley Scott made this work. Each time it's a little bit different, and it's very informative as to the way other people are viewing this situation. So The Last Duel worked for me much better than I expected. However, keep in mind, you are going to have to revisit sexual assault multiple times in this movie. It can be very unpleasant. And also keep in mind, while this is about knights, and you do learn quite a bit about the structure of knightship and what it means to be a squire and all of that, that's all the background, that's all the backdrop, that's the setting. This is ultimately about the way women were treated during this time period. It is based on a true story, and the production design is fantastic. Ridley Scott kills it with historical dramas. This one is less epic than anything I think he's ever done. It's very, very focused on a small group of people, but I think he killed it. And while it's not the most rewatchable thing I saw in 2021, it was a real gem that far too many people passed on. However, I say that to say this. My number 3 pick also came out in 2021. It is one of my favorite things I watched that year because I was so surprised by it. Let Him Go stars Kevin Costner and Diane Lane as grandparents. Now, this too can be a very upsetting movie. The movie opens up with the death of their son, and then sometime later, their widowed daughter-in-law marries into a wicked family and takes their grandson with her. And then they decide they want to get involved and try to make sure that he's safe. As dry and as simple as all that sounds, this is an incredibly rough movie. The family that she marries into is home to some really nasty characters played by some really fantastic actors. Jeffrey Donovan being one of them. He always plays really fun characters. This is no exception. And then Leslie Manville is sort of the matriarch of this really wicked wee boy family. Does a fantastic job in one scene in particular. I honestly could not believe some of the directions that this went. It was way grittier than I expected it to be, meaning I honestly don't recommend this for everybody. Similar to my recommendation on Killerman, the violence in this movie took me by surprise, and I watch a lot of stuff like this, but for some reason, Let Him Go just did not seem like it was going to be that type of movie, and I was kind of hit over the head with some things in this movie. It was that intense. Again, if you generally like my crime recommendations, watch this one, but even with me saying all this, be prepared to be surprised by this one. Now, my number 2 pick was not overlooked when it was released. It actually won an Academy Award for Best Picture the year that it came out, but for some reason it has not held up with time, despite the fact that I think it's one of the better Best Picture winners to have come out in the last 10 years or so. I'm talking about Argo. Now, obviously this stars and was directed by Ben Affleck, despite the fact that he did not get a nomination for Best Director when this came out. I kind of know why, but that's a long story for maybe another video one day. But in Argo, there are some fantastic characters, fantastic lines. It's a really great caper that was really well directed. Whether or not Ben Affleck did it all himself, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But it was one of the most fun movies to win Best Picture up until Parasite, and one of the truly best Picture winners. I did a whole video on this years ago, how they have a weird system for picking the Best Picture. It's different from the other categories, and it always ends up picking sort of one in the middle. It's weird. I'm not making it up. It's bizarre. But Argo was one of my favorite ones that year, and it won. And for whatever reason, as entertaining as this movie is, and as much of a crowd pleaser as it is, it just has not been remembered over time. If it's been a while since you've seen it, I can guarantee you forgot how good Argo is. And then we're going to wrap this list up with one of my favorite Coen Brothers movies of all time. Obviously, they're some of the most famous directors in the world, having done movies like The Big Lebowski, Fargo, No Country for Old Men. But their very first movie came out the year I was born, came out in 1984, and they filmed it for $1 million that they raised from lawyers and dentists. I mean, true blue indie filmmaking in the 80s before it was a big thing. They did that to make Blood Simple, which I think is still one of their best movies. Now, they would develop and mature over the years as directors, but to go back and watch Blood Simple and see that they had literally no experience creating a movie, for this to be the first thing that they made, it's pretty incredible, and it still holds up, certainly as one of their best. Like, I can honestly say, as much as I love them, there's about half of their movies that just don't really work for me. I like them once, never really care to watch them again. But Blood Simple is not one of those movies. In fact, I consider Blood Simple to be the first in a trilogy, followed by Fargo and No Country for Old Men. If you generally like their more serious crime-based movies, then Blood Simple is definitely going to be for you. Again, it's not quite as refined, doesn't quite feel like a Coen Brothers movie, but it's damn close, and it really is kind of a remarkable directorial debut. If you generally like my recommendations, or you're a budding movie buff and you've never seen Blood Simple, make it one of the first movies you watch after watching this video. But that is the list. Let me know in the comments below if there's anything else I should keep my eyes peeled for. You never know, one of your recommendations might make it onto a future video. If you'd like to see your name presented here at the end of every video, you could become a Patreon supporter and support the channel. There's a link in the video description where you can check that out. Don't forget there's also that Athletic Greens link in that video description. You can go get your free gift if you want to sign up for that. But I will keep making these videos as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special HBO Max episode, and you will see me on the next one.